Hello everyone! Welcome to Literature Revision with Mr. Johnston. Today, we're going to look at the final moments of an Inspector Calls. In particular, we will analyse the effects of the two plot twists with which Priestley ends his play. Click a link in the description box below to download a section of my textbook on this extract for free. The textbook comes complete with writing tables for taking notes, short writing tasks and exemplar paragraphs. And now, on to the final moments of the play. Let's now summarise this final scene. Now that the inspector has left, the Birling parents become very worried. They feared that their reputations could be ruined in a public scandal around their family's treatment of Eva Smith. Eric and Sheila are, however, not concerned about such a scandal. They are instead exasperated at their parents' failure to express any remorse for their treatment of Eva Smith. Gerald arrives back at the house. He has some important news. Gerald says that he met a police sergeant during his walk outside. The sergeant told him there is no officer in Brumley named Inspector Goole. Gerald next convincingly argues that Goole was not a real police inspector at all. Gerald believes the whole investigation was a hoax. To confirm this, Arthur calls the local hospital and is told that no suicide has been brought in for weeks. The Birling parents and Gerald are delighted that no public scandal will break out. Gerald attempts to recommence his engagement with Sheila, but is turned down. She thinks they have both changed too drastically throughout the night's events. Birling then answers a call from the police. A young woman has died after swallowing some disinfectant, and the police inspector is on his way to question the family. The play ends with the Birlings preparing to repeat their ordeal all over again. This video will focus on answering the following question. How does Priestley explore the theme of responsibility in the final scene of the play? As we shall see, the final moments of this play are very significant. They provide the clearest indication of whether each character has accepted the inspector's message of responsibility. You may remember the inspector's final speech about responsibility before he left the Birling house. Goole suggested that there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. In other words, he is suggesting that there are millions of poor and vulnerable people whose society must take responsibility for protecting. He suggested that everyone in society is interconnected, as if we all belong to one body. We are not just responsible for ourselves, we are responsible for each other. He warned that if people don't learn this lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. This is a terrifying prophecy of bloodshed and destruction. As we shall see, some characters choose to embrace this message about responsibility, while others choose to reject it. This brings us to our first idea that we will analyse in this video. Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. After the inspector departs, Birling becomes very agitated. He is worried that there will be a public scandal around the family's treatment of Eva Smith. Such a scandal would ruin Birling's chances of receiving a knighthood. This is the very honour that he has been boasting about throughout the play. Some audience members may feel rather surprised by Arthur's focus here. The inspector's investigation has revealed that Arthur's decision to fire Eva Smith contributed to this vulnerable woman's death. You might expect Arthur to display some sense of guilt or remorse for his actions. But no. Arthur's mind is focused completely on avoiding a public scandal. He does not think about the disastrous consequences of his actions on Eva Smith at all. Arthur's behaviour very much reveals his priorities. He does not display any sense of guilt for his treatment of Eva Smith. Instead, his discomfort arises solely from his selfish desire to protect his reputation. Arthur has clearly not, therefore, learned from the inspector's message about taking responsibility for the poor and vulnerable. He only looks out for himself. Mrs. Birling displays a similarly selfish perspective. She hardly mentions Eva Smith at all. Instead, Mrs. Birling fixates on the inspector's rude and assertive manner. As an upper-class woman, Mrs. Birling is offended. She is dismayed that a police inspector could dare talk to her in such an obnoxious manner. She feels that she has not been treated with the respect that a lady of her social status deserves. Some audience members might feel rather surprised by Mrs. Birling's focus here. The inspector's investigation has revealed that Mrs. Birling's refusal to provide charitable support to Eva Smith led to this vulnerable woman's death and the death of Mrs. Birling's own grandchild. You might expect Mrs. Birling to express some sense of guilt or remorse for her actions, but no. Mrs. Birling is instead fixated on the inspector's rude manner. She does not mention Eva Smith at all. Mrs. Birling's words very much reflect her priorities. She is more preoccupied with matters of respectability and politeness than she is with the notion that her prejudiced behaviour could have contributed to the death of Eva Smith. Just like Arthur, Mrs. Birling has not, therefore, learned to take responsibility for the poor and vulnerable. The Birling parents' reaction to the supposed discovery that the investigation is a hoax is equally revealing. Upon hearing this news, Birling looks triumphantly at the other characters. These stage directions suggest that Birling feels victorious, as if he has just won a battle. Now, what is the cause of this reaction? Well, it seems that Birling is overjoyed that his reputation is secure, that a public scandal will no longer break out, that he may, indeed, receive his knighthood. In short, Birling is delighted that he will face no negative consequences for his treatment of Eva Smith. This moment is revealing. Priestley thus demonstrates that the selfish businessman is only concerned about the consequences of his actions upon himself. Birling does not care about the effects of his actions on other people. Let's move on now to Gerald. Gerald is a more ambiguous character than Sybil and Arthur. As a man who genuinely cared for Eva, he does possess some redeeming qualities that the Birling parents certainly lack. But, as we shall see, Gerald does join Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling in failing to learn from the inspector's lessons about responsibility. Believing that the investigation was a hoax, Gerald attempts to recommence his engagement with Sheila. He states, "Everything's all right now, Sheila," as he offers the engagement ring again. Why does Gerald believe that everything's all right now? Well, it seems that he, like Arthur, is relieved about avoiding a public scandal. As a respectable aristocratic gentleman, Gerald's reputation could potentially be ruined if the shameful details of his affair with Daisy were revealed. Yet, all worry is now banished from Gerald's mind. There will be no scandal. His reputation is secure, and he can carry on with his life. In Gerald's view, everything is, indeed, all right. In similarity to the Birling parents, Gerald therefore only seems to worry about the negative effects that the night's events could have upon himself. He evidently feels little remorse about his treatment of Daisy. Gerald thus joins the Birling parents in his failure to take responsibility for the effects of his actions on others by the end of the play. We have now finished looking at our first idea. Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. We will now test you on this idea. We will read through the sentence one more time. Pay particular attention to the words in bold. These are the key words which will disappear. Number 1. Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. Let's now test you on this idea. You have 10 seconds to read through the sentence, filling in the key words. Off you go. Okay, let's now see how well we have done. Number 1, Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. Well done if you got all of those right. On to our second idea. Priestley demonstrates that the younger generation accepts responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. As we have seen, the older generation of characters, Mr Birling, Mrs Birling and Gerald, reject the inspector's message about responsibility. We will now analyse the younger generation's response to the inspector's message. As we will see, a generational divide is revealed in this scene. Whereas the older generation reject the inspector's message about responsibility, the younger generation, as symbolised by Sheila and Eric, embrace this lesson. Let's begin by looking at Eric. In contrast to his parents, Eric is uninterested in whether a public scandal could occur, and dismisses the question of whether Goole is a real inspector as irrelevant. He thinks such ideas miss the real point. Every member of a Birling family has cruelly abused a poor and vulnerable woman. He is uninterested in trying to deny responsibility for his treatment of Eva. So, as we can see, Eric has changed a huge amount from the immature drunkard at the start of the play. What has brought about such a change? Well, it seems that Eric has been transformed by the influence of the inspector. Goole has clearly played a central role in Eric's development. We can see this through Eric's words. Dismissing claims that the inspector was a fake, Eric states that Goole was our police inspector, alright. Rather than fretting about Goole's actual identity, Eric focuses upon the personal impact that the inspector has had on his life. Eric realizes that Goole has served as his inspector. In other words, Goole has inspected and revealed the dark secrets of Eric's life. The investigation has revealed to Eric just how selfish he really is. In a sense, Goole has played the role of Eric's conscience. The transformative effects of Goole's influence on this character is reflected in this scene. In particular, we must look at Eric's conflict with his father. When Birling reminds Eric about the stolen money, his son exclaims, "The money's not the important thing. It's what happens to the young woman and what we did to her that matters." Here, Eric rejects the materialistic focus of his father. He refuses to accept Birling's obsessive focus on money. Birling obsessively worries about recovering the money that Eric has stolen, but his son rejects such selfishness. Eric now understands what truly matters: the fact that he and the rest of his family abused and exploited Eva Smith. Eric recognizes that every member of the Birling family is guilty for Eva Smith's death. They each have blood upon their hands. Eric thus rejects the naive narrow-mindedness of his parents' perspective. Appalled at listening to his parents reveling in the idea that the investigation was a hoax, Eric criticizes such nice, cozy talk. So here, Eric becomes angry with his parents. He is shocked by their failure to recognize the seriousness of their actions. When Eric talks about his parents' nice, cozy talk, he is critiquing their attempts to pretend that they have done nothing wrong. Even if every member of a family has interacted with a different woman, this does not change their actions. The fact is that each family member has still wronged a young woman. Eric recognizes this and refuses to live in his parents' comfortable world in which they ignore the effects of their actions on others. Now, let's take a look at Sheila. This character is similarly disapproving of her parents' naivety. She states, "It frightens me the way you talk." Such words demonstrate that Sheila is unsettled and perplexed by her parents' failure to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. She is frightened about the consequences of such a naive perspective. Perhaps Sheila remembers the inspector's grim prophecy of fire and blood and anguish coming upon a world that fails to look after the poor and vulnerable. She recognizes that the selfish attitude exemplified by her parents could have grave consequences. Sheila continues this criticism. She says that our parents are childish for pretending that nothing much has happened. Let's zoom in a little bit more to this idea that the Birling parents are pretending and acting in a childish way. Pretending is a significant aspect of a child's play. When they engage in make-believe games, children like to pretend to be all sorts of things. You probably did this as a kid too. You maybe pretended to be a superhero, or a spy, or a dinosaur. Kids enjoy living in these fantasy worlds in which they can escape from reality by pretending to be something else. According to Sheila, Mr Birling and Mrs Birling are acting just like kids right now. In a sense, they are playing their own make-believe game. Sheila recognizes that Mr and Mrs Birling live in a rose-tinted fantasy in which they pretend that the consequences of their selfish actions on others are irrelevant. Sheila is implying that her parents' failure to take responsibility for their actions is comparable to the make-believe games played by children. Priestley thus demonstrates that a role reversal has taken place between the two generations. In their rejection of their parents' narrow-minded perspective, it is in fact Sheila and Eric, the younger generation, who display a more sober, mature perspective than their elders. So, as we have seen, Priestley creates a generational divide in this scene. Whereas the older generation reject the inspector's message about responsibility, the younger generation, as symbolized by Sheila and Eric, embrace this lesson. Now, this play is a work of social criticism, which means that Priestley is always saying something about his society. We can therefore ask ourselves this question: what is Priestley suggesting about his society through this generational divide? I would argue that this clash between the generations reflects Priestley's hopes for his 1945 post-war audience. In this interpretation, the Birling parents and Gerald could represent the generation whose irresponsibility brought Europe into the horrors of the 20th century, as exemplified by the two world wars. If this is the case, then Eric and Sheila may represent the younger generation who would become the future leaders of a post-war world. Priestley may be using Eric and Sheila's more responsible outlook to represent his hopes for his 1945 post-war audience. The playwright may be expressing optimism that this younger generation would rebuild the nation through embracing a socialist ideology and thereby creating a fairer society which cares for the poor and vulnerable. Let me explain this interpretation to you again in a slightly different way. Once again, I will emphasize that this is a personal interpretation. You are free to disagree with it. In this interpretation, Priestley may be suggesting that Mr Birling, Gerald and Sheila irresponsibly ignored their cruel treatment of Eva Smith in a similar way as the previous generation irresponsibly brought Europe into two world wars. Eric and Sheila meanwhile accept their responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith in a similar way as the post-war generation may accept responsibility for looking after the poor and vulnerable through building a socialist society. And that brings us to the end of our second idea. Priestley demonstrates that the younger generation accepts responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. We will now test you upon these two ideas. We will read through them one more time and then the keywords will disappear. Number 1. Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. And number 2, Priestley demonstrates that the younger generation accepts responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. Let's now test your memory. You have 20 seconds to fill in the keywords. Off you go. Okay, let's now see how well we have done. Number 1, Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. And number 2, Priestley demonstrates that the younger generation accepts responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. Well done if you got all of those right. On to our third idea. The final twist at the end of a play confirms the truth of the inspector's lesson about responsibility. Towards the end of the play, everything seems to be going very well for Mr. Birling. He believes that the investigation was a hoax, and therefore no longer worries about a public scandal. Mr. Birling is therefore unimpressed by the behaviour of his children. Birling makes fun of Eric and Sheila for still feeling ashamed of their treatment of Eva Smith. Mr. Birling therefore mocks the famous younger generation, who can't even take a joke. Birling evidently views the whole investigation as a trivial prank. He thinks that Inspector Gould was a fake, who simply wanted to cause some mischief. Birling now finds the whole affair rather funny. Yet, the audience will recognise that this investigation was anything but funny. Gould has revealed that each character has done some terrible things. The investigation has revealed that every character has shamefully abused a young woman. The fact is, Mr. Birling did unfairly fire a young woman from his factory. Fueled by jealousy, Sheila did ensure that a young woman was unfairly fired from Millwards. Gerald did have an affair with a young woman and then break up with her when it suited him. Eric did force a young woman to sleep with him. And Mrs. Birling did allow her prejudice to prevent a vulnerable young woman from receiving charitable support. Each character may have been interacting with a different lady, but this does not take away the fact that they have each abused their power to exploit a young woman. The audience is therefore likely to disagree with Birling's view that the night's events have simply been a joke. But Birling's dismissive attitude suggests that he views these shocking revelations as completely irrelevant. He evidently does not feel any discomfort about his family's actions, because the investigation is no longer going to lead to a scandal. It is now just a funny joke. This once again further reflects Birling's selfish attitude. He is happy to mistreat others insofar as it does not undermine his self-interest. Priestley undermines Mr. Birling's mocking words through interrupting him with the ringing of the telephone. A young woman has in fact died, and the police inspector is on the way to question the family. This moment very much undermines Birling's belief that the family's mistreatment of this young woman is irrelevant. The phone call confirms that the Birlings' behaviour has indeed contributed to a young woman's death. Their actions have indeed had serious consequences. The events of the night are not a funny joke at all. Priestley thus finishes the play by re-establishing the truth of the inspector's message. Our treatment of other people does indeed have consequences. The individual is indeed responsible for others. Priestley thus finishes the play at exactly the same place as the play began. The Birlings are once again going to be investigated for their role in a young woman's death. We have ended up in exactly the same place we were at the beginning. This is what we call a circular narrative structure. The narrative ends in the same place as it begins. But why does Priestley use this structure? What might he be suggesting? Well, maybe Priestley is using the circular structure to warn his society about the circular nature of its history. As the inspector warned, if society does not take responsibility for its members, it will be punished in fire and blood and anguish. Priestley may be suggesting that this prophecy was fulfilled in the 2 world wars. Society has been punished for its failure to take responsibility for its members, not once, but twice. Writing for his 1945 audience, Priestley may therefore be suggesting that the only way to break out of such a cycle is to build a more responsible socialist society that protects the poor and vulnerable. Otherwise, the same vicious cycle of blood and destruction will begin again. In this interpretation, the circular structure of Priestley's play therefore reflects the circular nature of Priestley's view of history. We have now finished our third and final point. The final twist at the end of the play confirms the truth of the inspector's lesson about responsibility. In a minute, we will test you upon these 3 ideas. Let's read through them one last time. Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. Number 2, Priestley demonstrates that the younger generation accepts responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. And number 3, the final twist at the end of the play confirms the truth of the inspector's lesson about responsibility. Let's now test your memory. Okay, you've got 30 seconds now to go through these 3 sentences, filling in the key words. Off you go. Right, let's see how well we have done. Okay, number 1. Priestley demonstrates that the older generation fails to take responsibility for their treatment of Eva Smith. Number 2, Priestley demonstrates that the younger generation accepts responsibility for the treatment of Eva Smith. And number 3, the final twist at the end of the play confirms the truth of the inspector's lesson about responsibility. Well done if you got all of those right. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you want to learn more about the inspector calls, you can see more links to different videos on this page. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I will be releasing more videos on the inspector calls across the coming weeks and months. But for now, all the best.